What is temptation? What do we need to know about temptation as followers of Jesus? Why is temptation so dangerous and deceptive? By the end of this teaching, you'll know what the Bible really teaches about temptation in order to stand strong in the daily battle against sin. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 13, Jesus says, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." This is part of how we should pray on a daily basis to God. Temptation is the enemy's attempt to lure you into sin through your own sinful cravings and appetites. Temptation can be thought of as a time of testing. It's a test for you to reveal your love and your loyalty to God. Temptation is sinful desire that originates within our own fleshly body and nature. So here's what you should know about temptation. Everything that would be helpful to know. Number one, temptation is something we rely on God to deliver us from. You cannot fight temptation in your own human strength and by sheer willpower. We need to rely on God to deliver us from that. It doesn't mean you don't have a responsibility, and it doesn't mean you don't put any effort into it, but it is God ultimately who provides the strength because it's a spiritual battle that requires spiritual power. Temptation is expected and even necessary in this life, according to Matthew 18:7. Temptation is not something we overcome by pure human strength and willpower, like I said. It's something that can even come through people. Luke chapter 17 warns against this. Temptation is something you should anticipate and guard yourself against and be prepared for, according to 1 Corinthians 7. And temptation is not new. It's actually very common. Every single temptation that we face has already been faced by someone else at some point. In other words, we are not alone in this, and we can take comfort in the fact that God has already delivered someone else through what I'm going through. 1 Corinthians 10:13 speaks of this. And temptation is a snare intended to lure people into ruin and destruction. 1 Timothy 6:9 talks about that. See, Jesus has also been tempted at every point, actually, in ways that we will never experience, and yet he remained perfectly obedient to the Father and never sinned, according to Matthew chapter 4. Temptation is a test of our self-control and our loyalty to God. Without the test, there is no real opportunity to prove genuine love and faith in God. Temptation is never beyond our God-given ability. There's always an escape that God provides, but it is not something we can do in our own strength. Again, it's God giving us the ability and the grace to face it, to endure it, and to get through it. Temptation is also very sneaky, very subtle, and it's hard to recognize sometimes, according to Galatians 6, is it's sometimes totally off our radar and we don't recognize that we're facing temptation until it's too late. But God has given us the ability to recognize temptation more and more as we know His Word better. We become more, cognizant of temptation in our life, and it becomes more clear when we're facing temptation, and we're quicker to recognize that the more we know the Word of God. Jesus has resisted every kind of temptation in order to show us what it looks like to endure the time of testing, and He provides the spiritual strength for us if we humbly depend on Him, according to Hebrews 2:18. So because Jesus has been tempted at every single point, and because He's our perfect high priest, He models for us that it is possible to resist temptation if we rely on the leading of the Spirit and the strength He provides. And temptation does not always come from some outside source. I know it's easier to just blame something else for our temptation, but most every temptation originates within our own flesh, within our own body. James 1:13 speaks of this. And temptation never comes from God. He does not tempt, but He will allow the time of testing. He will allow the time of testing for our growth, for our edification, for our own strengthening, for Him to reveal some aspect of who He is. But God always works good through the time of testing, though He is not the one tempting us directly. And temptation always has an agenda. There's always a hidden, secret, dark agenda behind temptation, and the end goal is always death and destruction. But just like Joseph said to his brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. So temptation can grow and actually bring forth chaos and darkness into the world through our decision to sin. According to James 1:15, temptation is literally offering us the opportunity to become conduits of chaos and darkness in our world. When we choose to sin, we are aligning with the kingdom of darkness and allowing sin to bring more chaos and darkness into the world through our own decision to rebel against God. And that might be a strong statement and it doesn't make you any less a child of God, but Romans chapter 6 and James 1 talks about this, that sin breeds death and destruction, and temptation is the precursor to sin. Sin always comes after the temptation. So there is never a time where we sin without the temptation. There's always that initial luring, that initial leading us into the trap. And it's our job to learn how to recognize that by knowing the Word of God and by having our discernment trained. That's what temptation really is. And if you want the scriptures and the notes for this teaching, you can find those in the full free course for new believers on our website under Session 33, Temptation. Be sure to review the scriptures and the notes before the next session. Share this with someone. Visit our website. And I will see you in the next video where we address the question, what is spiritual warfare?